Chapter 3: Patriarchal Prism: Poverty, Subordination, and Inequality of Women, Feminization of Poverty. At the end of this chapter, you will know the following: 1. What is patriarchy? 2. How patriarchy causes women's subordination. 3. Know the global scenario of women's inequality. 4. Status of women's poverty. 5. Understand feminization of poverty. This chapter deals with three basic concepts. 1 is patriarchy, 2 is inequality, and 3 poverty. Patriarchy is analysis and identified as the main reason for women's subordination and inequality. It focuses on the areas of men's control over women in a patriarchal system. It also shows how patriarchy is used as a weapon on both women's subordination as well as the different means of women's escape from the situation of patriarchy. Women's poverty is also analyzed as a result of patriarchal traditions, cultural norms. The concept of feminization of poverty is explained, and emphasis is presented on the current debates around the concept. What is patriarchy? The concept of patriarchy is indispensable for an analysis of gender inequality. Theory of patriarchy is essential to capture the depth, persuasiveness, and interconnectedness of different aspects of women's subordination. Walby, 1990, 1-2. The concept of patriarchy is not new. It has history within feminist thought. It has been used within the women's movement to analyze the principles of women's oppression and subordination. It virtually every known aspect, past and present, women have not been treated as the full equals of men. In many other societies, women have been and are severely oppressed. The concept of patriarchy was first articulated by radical feminists in the early 1970s. It arose from within the movement and expressed the systematic character of the oppressive and exploitative relations which affect women. Chahchi, 1988, page 82. Patriarchy is not a single or simple concept but has a variety of different meanings and a variety of definitions. Defining patriarchy. Patriarchy is best defined as control by men. Obviously, both in the developed and developing countries, the culture is patriarchal. Men have the power and control women. Patriarchy is defined as the organization of society on the supremacy of the father in the clan or family, the legal dependence of the wives and children, and the reckoning of descent and inheritance in the male line. Webster's Dictionary. Walby, 1990, defines patriarchy as a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women. Within the feminist writings, radical feminist writers like Kate Millett states that patriarchy has been used to refer to male domination and to the power relationships by which men dominate women. Millett, 1969. Marxist feminists have attempted to analyze the relationship between the subordination of women and the organization of various modes of production. In other words, Marxist feminists have not only simply analyzed patriarchy, but the relationship between patriarchy and the capitalist mode of production. This is because they do not believe that the subordination of women can be absolutely separated from the other forms of exploitation and oppression that exist in capitalist societies, for example, class exploitation and racism. Beachy, 1979-67. Within the Marxist feminist literature, patriarchy has been used in various ways. Patriarchy is used to refer in kinship systems in which men exchange women and to the symbolic power which fathers have within these systems, and the consequences of this power for the inferiorized psychology of women. Mitchell, 1974, 402. The psychological remnants of patriarchy have a dreadful hold on women. It explains why men remain in control and why they can get women to do in other women. The frustration of women in such a system often results in horizontal violence as women attaching each other. It explains why some women stay in the background until other women have opened the way and they push their sister aside and take an opportunity away from her. It explains why women usually do not believe in women and why women so often lack self-confidence. It explains why women continue to need male support and recognition and why women fail to take bold steps towards change. Eisenstein defines patriarchy as sexual hierarchy which is manifested in the women's role as mother, domestic laborer, and consumer within the family. Eisenstein, 1979. Patriarchy needs to be conceptualized at different levels of abstraction. At the most abstract level, it exists as a system of social relations. Capitalism and patriarchy are viewed as two systems of social relations that interact in every domain of social life. Gibson Graham, 1996, page 64. The main basis of the tension between capitalism and patriarchy is over the exploitation of women's laborers. On the one hand, capitalists have interest in the recruitment and exploitation of female labor, which is cheaper than that of men because of patriarchal structures. As Walby, 1990, mentioned that women are experiencing dual forms of public/private patriarchy. Private patriarchy is based upon household production as the main site of women's oppression. Public patriarchy is based principally in public sites such as employment and the state. In private patriarchy, the expropriation of women's labor takes place primarily by individual patriarchs within the household. While in the public form it is a more collective appropriation, in private patriarchy the principal strategy is exclusionary. In the public, it is segregation and subordinating. Walby 1990-24. At a less abstract level, patriarchy is composed of 6 structures. 1. Patriarchal mode of production. This refers to the way through which women's household labor is expropriated by their husbands or cohabitants. The women may receive her maintenance in exchange for her labor. Housewives and are the producing class, while husbands are the expropriating class. Patriarchal relations in paid work. This is a complex form of patriarchal closure within waged labor, excluding women from the better forms of work and segregate them into the worse jobs, which are deemed to be less skilled. Patriarchal relations in the state. The state is patriarchal as well as capitalist and racist. The state has a systematic bias towards patriarchal interests in its policies and actions. Male violence. Male violence constitutes a further structure despite its apparently individualistic and diverse form. Male violence against women is systematically condoned and legitimated by the state's refusal to intervene against it except in exceptional instances, though the practices of rape, wife beating, sexual harassment, etc. are not considered part of the state. 5. Patriarchal relations in sexuality, compulsory heterosexuality, and the sexual double standards are 2 of the key forms of this structure. 6. Patriarchal relations in cultural institutions. These are significant for the generation of a variety of gender differentiated forms of subjectivity. The structure is composed of a set of institutions which create the representation of women within a patriarchal gaze in a variety of areas such as religion, education, and the media. Walby 1990-21. These 6 structures identified are real, deep structures necessary to capture the gender relations in different societies. According to noted gender activist Kamla Basin, in a patriarchal system, women's lives controlled by men in the following areas. Women's productive or labor power. She states that in a patriarchy, it is both inside the household and outside that men exercise control over women's work. She notes Sylvia Walby and mentions that when women work within the household, they usually provide services in looking after their children, husbands, and other family members, such as old parents or other relations, living with them, and these services are considered free, and women's work are exploited by their husbands in such a system termed as the patriarchal mode of production. Even when women provide these activities within the family, they remain dependent on their husbands, as a result of which the husbands are always controlling and expropriating them. Women's labor are also controlled by men when they work outside in productive work. This may happen in 2 ways. First, they may prevent them from working outside. Second, they may often force them to sell their labor in doing exploitative work and taking away the income they earn by being involved in illegal work. Again, the men may allow them to work only part-time, not allowing them to use their full capable labor power. Sometimes women are often forced to work at very low wages within the home as domestic workers in other homes where they are exploited by their masters. In short, it may be said that men earn economic gains through exploiting women's labor power. Women's reproduction. This is another area where men exert control over women. In many societies, especially in third world, poor developing countries such as India and Bangladesh, women, specifically rural poor, literate backward women, do not have the right to choose when to bear children or how many children they would like to have. They do not have the power to decide whether they will use contraceptive to control pregnancy or terminate a pregnancy. In this aspect, religion, traditional culture, and taboos play a dominant role in controlling women's reproductive choice, an outcome of patriarchy. Motherhood is also a controlling factor in patriarchy. Motherhood is considered as one of the forms of women's oppression because it creates feminine and masculine character types which perpetuate patriarchy. The currently widespread theory about human characteristics is that some human characteristics are masculine and some are feminine. And so, human wholeness is divided. Because the patriarch holds the male is superior to the female, the human characteristics assigned to the female that are called feminine are said to be inferior to those qualities assigned to the male and called masculine. For example, aggression is necessary for dominance. The male develops this characteristic, calls it masculine, and assigns it opposite, timidity and femininity. Women are then said to be naturally fearful and lacking in courage. It creates and strengthens the divide between public and private. It restricts women's mobility and growth, and it reproduces male dominance. Basin, 1993. Control over women's sexuality. Women are usually subordinate due to men's control over women's sexuality. Women are often forced to please their men by providing sexual services when they demand, despite their unwillingness. On the other hand, men may even force their wives, daughters, or sisters to get engaged in prostitution and thus get involved in trading activities in dealing with this issue. Rape and threat of rape are also used as instruments of controlling women's sexuality, thus putting them into shame and dishonor. In this respect, one thing is very important, that is, women's dress, behavior, and mobility needs to be carefully observed by the family in order to control women's sexuality by men. Women's mobility. Men control women's mobility in order to control the sexuality, productive and reproductive work. Men force women to use purda, thus restricting their movement outside the domestic sphere, thus resulting in separation of private and public divide. Control over women's mobility also restricts women's freedom and enjoyment of their rights. Property and other economic resources. The productive resources in a family are usually controlled by men and follows a patrilineal pattern, that is, from men to men. For example, in the case of Bangladesh, we often find that resources are divided among men in a hierarchical order, that is, from father to eldest son and the next one. There is no change for women to be included or intrude in the process. Even if women have the legal right to inherit any assets, the whole system of customary practices, emotional pressure, social sanctions prevent them from acquiring and enjoying these rights. Thus, in all issues, women are naturally discriminated and remain in a disadvantaged site throughout their lives. Basin, 2001, 6-9. In addition to these traditional and customary practices that control women in a patriarchy, there are certain institutions which are patriarchy in nature and exert control over women. These include the family. The family, the basic institution in a society, is the most patriarchal in nature. The hierarchical relations existing in the family keeps men at the top and women at the lowest rungs of the hierarchical order. It is within the family that we are taught and learn the ideas of subordination, discrimination. Usually boys learn to be assertive and dominant, while girls are asked to be submissive. Qualities considered masculine are valued, qualities considered feminine are devalued and held in contempt. For example, in early life, we socialize our children into sex stereotyped roles. For example, if a boy cries, we often say, "Boys don't cry," and thereby socialize the little boy into hardness, toughness, and insensitivity. We teach the little boy how to be masculine, and we place a high value on the qualities we consider masculine. At the same time, we allow girl child some of the natural sensitive qualities. When a girl is young, we more or less allow her to be active, but when she reaches puberty, we expect her to become feminine. We have very little toleration for her if she does not conform to the social notions of femininity. Religion. One cannot think to write about patriarchy without considering patriarchal religion and the effect such religion has on the oppression of women. Religion cannot be ignored. It seems very deep in the human psyche, and it affects its widespread in both the individual and in society. Most modern religions are patriarchal, defining male authority as supreme. All major religions have been created, interpreted, and controlled by upper-class men. Men have also put words into the mouth of God about the supposed inferiority of women. All this has caused serious harm to women, for which some men in positions of power must take responsibility. The legal system in most countries, especially in the third world South Asian regions, the legal system is highly male biased. That is, it favors men and economically powerful classes with regard to the ownership of property. Matters arising in the family, marriage, and inheritance rights all are linked to the patriarchal control of men over women. Even in the interpretation of law, it is the males who dominate. Economic institutions. From the very beginning of civilization, it was found that women were deprived of all productive activities, even when they were engaged in some sort of productive activities like producing food, mainly in Africa, where it is known that nearly 80% of the food produced in Africa are women's work, but this was never recognized or valued. It was not until the research conducted by Esther Bozarab that women's contribution in the economy was given recognition. She was the pioneer in mentioning the reality that in most agricultural countries, mostly in third world countries, the fact about women's positive contribution in the economy which needs to be recognized. In her path-breaking book, Women's Role in Economic Development, she has established this reality. Moreover, women's role as producers and rearers of children is not considered as an economic contribution at all, as they are not valued in monetary terms. Bazin, 1993, page 11. Political system and institutions. In almost all countries of South Asia, political institutions at all levels, from the village councils to the national parliament, are male-dominated. Even in the political parties, there are very few women. The chapter on women in politics gives a clear picture of women's situation in the political system in Bangladesh. Even when women hold the key positions in the political areas, such as we find in Sri Lanka, India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, They are usually surrounded by men who are always dominating them in every policy adopted by the government. In India, the introduction of the women in the Panchayat Raj system did bring about a change in the situation of women in the local levels, but at the national level, they are still struggling for reservation of 30% of seats. Although in Bangladesh, the women are directly elected in the local councils, union parished, there is not much improvement achieved in their power position in relation to men. The same patriarchal system prevails as previously. Media. Today, the media has become a very important tool for the portraying of the negative image of women. Both the point and electronic media system are doing everything to portray all negative facts and figures about the activities of women. There is hardly any news about the positive work done by women in any sphere. The media is totally controlled by men. As a result, news about men's progress, success, and prosperity, and females' failure, inferiority are depicted in the newspaper. Most often, the newspaper publishes the news of violence against women, but there is hardly any news about the perpetrators committing the violent acts. Educational institutions and knowledge systems. Basin 2001 1912. The seat of formal education and learning have become a ownership of the male sector. Stereotyped ideas still prevail regarding the choice of subjects between male and female students. Females are discouraged to study science subjects such as biology, botany, pharmacy, engineering, which is still considered to be the domain of males, while females are encouraged to study philosophy, literature, history, psychology, political science. The male hegemony over the creation of knowledge marginalized women's knowledge and experiences, their expertise and aspirations. Finally, we may conclude by saying that patriarchy has also institutionalized violence against women by men's control over women. In fact, violence against women is so pervasive that Sylvia Walby calls male violence a structure, inequality, and women. While women represent 50% of the world's adult population and one-third of the official labor force, they perform nearly two-thirds of all working hours and receive only one-tenth of the world income and own less than 1% of the world's property. United Nations 1980. Despite such investments in time and labor by women, why is there so much discrimination and inequality? In answering this question, let us first begin with a brief theoretical discussion of gender inequality over the last 3 decades. There 44. Page 44. Has been a dramatic increase in concern with the meaning and explanation of gender. Research in women in development has eventuated the consensus that gender is a fundamental organizing principle in human societies and in cultural production. Analytically, it has reached the status of class, ethnicity, state, and world system in social science. Today, it is also widely accepted that gender, like class and race and ethnicity, is a source of inequality. The gender as symmetry is a universal fact of life, is now a commonplace. In many societies around the world, women are discriminated against by law and by custom, rendering them among the vulnerable and disadvantaged social groups. As Papanik 1989 stated, gender differences based on the social construction of biological sex distinctions are one of the great fault lines of societies, those marks of difference among categories of persons that govern the allocation of power, authority, and resources. Since the 1970s, the concept of gender has addressed the following questions about gender inequality. How does it occur? Why does it take different forms? Why does it vary in degree across societies? What are the components that add up to gender inequality? What are the causes promoting gender inequality? How do various institutions and practices contribute to it? Are there any strategies of changing it? While culturally and historically bound, gender commonly is a function of power relations and the social organization of inequality. Another point about gender is that, like class and ethnicity, gender inequality is not one homogeneous phenomenon, but a collection of disparate and interlinked problems. Inequality between men and women can take many different forms. Gender inequality exists in most parts of the world, from the developed country of Japan to the least developed countries of Africa, and from the breakup countries of Russia to the United States of America. Sen 2001. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen 1991 has identified 7 levels of inequality of women. These are mortality inequality. Maternal mortality is the single largest cause of death in most developing countries. It directly involves matters of life and death and takes a brutal form of unusually high mortality rates of women. This is usually the case that woman becomes pregnant and she does not receive adequate care and health facilities required during pregnancy. She is even deprived of nutritious food required for both the child and the mother. Consequently, she develops various complications during pregnancy, which ultimately results in death of the woman. So women die more due to pregnancy. The importance of maternal mortality has been rated as often the best public health indicator of inequalities between men and women. Natality inequality. This refers to preferences for boys over girls that many male-dominated societies have, resulting in females' feticide. This is usually a practice in India, mainly in Bihar, where it happens that if the child to be born is identified as a female, The fetus is destroyed in the mother's womb before can be born. Basic facility inequality, a situation where girls have less opportunity of schooling than boys do. It may also include deficiencies in basic facilities available to women, varying from encouragement to cultivate one's natural talents to fair participation in rewarding social functions in the community. Speed facility inequality, gender bias in higher education and professional training for women are examples of inequality in providing special facilities to women. For example, when there are opportunities for any further training or professional development, men are given more preference than women. Professional inequality. In terms of employment, in promotion in work and occupation, women often face greater obstacles than men. It is often found that women face barriers from the household. The family often objects women from availing these facilities, leaving their family behind. Ownership inequality. Women face inequality in terms of ownership of property and even basic assets such as homes and land that can be asymmetrically shared. Regarding inheritance rights, it is already given that according to Sharia law, Muslim women have half of what the men own from their father's property. Example, if a family has one son and one daughter, the son gets half of the father's property while the daughter receives half of what the son gets. Furthermore, if a man has only daughters and he does not distribute his property as gifts to his daughters during his lifetime, then the property is shared by the family members of the father after his death. Household inequality. This refers to basic inequalities in gender relations within the family or the household. Usually, every family is biased towards the sons in terms of food. It is the son who gets the best and most nutritious food, and also food according to their choice, while the daughters are not given the opportunity to choose their food and often suffer from malnutrition. With regard to attending any parties or celebrations or going out, the sons is always given privilege, while daughters are rarely given permission. Women and poverty. Poverty is tied to a lack of access to productive resources, physical goods, and income, which results in individual and/or group deprivation, vulnerability, and powerlessness. It has various manifestations including hunger and malnutrition, ill health, and limited or no access to education, healthcare, and safe housing and paid work environments. It also includes experience of economic, political, and social discrimination. Chambers, 1991. Conventional approaches to poverty definition and measurement based on income consumption measures have been widely criticized for failing to capture human development outcomes. Sen, 1983, 1990, UNDP, 1997a. According to Kabir, gender inequality and poverty results from distinct interlocking social relations and processes. 1996 to 1997, she is given three approaches to poverty. Poverty line approach, which measures the economic means through which households and individuals meet their basic needs. Capabilities approach, where means other than earnings or transfer payments such as entitlements are brought along with ends. Participatory poverty assessment, which explored the causes and outcomes of poverty in more context-specific ways. Kabir, 2001. Within this concept, poverty may be defined as a state of deprivation. The concept of deprivation indicates the processes by which people become poor. In the last 3 decades, there has been a discernible trend for approaches to poverty have become more holistic. This has encompassed a shift from a narrow focus on incomes and consumption to recognition of poverty as a multidimensional phenomenon. Chant, 2001-87. This shift of analysis poverty from a quantitative to a more qualitative aspect, conceptualizing poverty from multidimensional perspectives, emphasizes on integration on the different concerns and needs originating from different dimensions of poverty. Among different dimensions, gender is an important concept for the analysis and eradication of poverty. Although poverty affects both men and women, it has a gender dimension. Gender dimension of poverty indicates how men and women experience poverty in different ways. In almost all circumstances, women suffer from poverty more acutely than men. The experience of poverty is both shared and distributed within families. All suffer, but women suffer more than men. Poverty is sometimes equated with certain conditions of maternal scarcity manifested in the high proportions of landless and poor households exposed to unemployment, low calorie intake, high incidence of child labor, high levels of child mortality, and low life expectancy. Poverty is also powerlessness that reduces people's capacity to earn substantial livelihoods. Poverty is also linked to unequal access to and distribution of resources and lack of control of productive resources and limited participation in political and economic institutions. Women's access to the needed required resources and services is much less than men, and this contributes immensely to make women the poorest of the poor. Again, key concepts within the realm of analyzing poverty as a more holistic approach includes entitlements and capabilities, Sen, 1981, 1985, 1987, and notions of vulnerabilities and poverty as a process, Chambers, 1983, 1989, and Haddad, 1991. Gender dimensions of poverty can be understood by using the notions of entitlements and capabilities. Amartya Sen 1991 has defined entitlements as the bundle of goods over which people can establish ownership through production of trade using their own means. Capabilities, on the other hand, have been defined as the alternative combination of functionings or doings and beings a person achieves and from which a person can choose. 1995. For example, in Bangladesh, it is found that the rural and urban poor women's relatively low entitlements are the source of their dependency, vulnerability, and low degree of autonomy. Similarly, their limited capabilities, such as low literacy or educational levels, tend to lock them up in the various vicious cycle of poverty and deprivation. The issue of assets, which are not only economic or physical in nature, labor, savings, and natural resources, but includes human capital such as education, skills, and social capital such as kin and friendship networks and support from community organizations, is also included in analyzing poverty. Powerlessness, isolation, poverty, physical weakness, and vulnerability. Risk and vulnerability to poverty have received added attention in recent years. Vulnerability in poverty is an important dimension of poverty and deprivation. Many individuals, households, and population groups, while not currently in poverty, are vulnerable to events that would easily push them into poverty. For example, a bad harvest, a lost job, an illness, unexpected environmental disasters such as tornado and tsunami in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, and cyclone Sidr in Bangladesh, which have made many households enter into the poverty zone by losing their means of livelihood. In simple language, poverty is a state of deprivation. Figure 1. The deprivation trap. Source Robert Chambers 1983. Rural Development, Putting the Last First, USA, Longman, INC. Poverty is tied to a lack of access to productive resources, physical goods, and income, which results in individual and or group deprivation. Vulnerability and powerlessness. It has various manifestations including hunger and malnutrition, ill health, and limited or no access to education, healthcare, and safe housing and paid work environments. It also includes experiences of economic, political, and social discrimination. Chambers 1991. Conventional approaches to poverty definition and measurement based on income consumption means have been widely criticized for failing to capture human development outcomes. Sen 1983, 1990, UNDP 1997a. According to the Kabir, gender inequality and poverty results from distinct interlocking social relations and processes, 1996 and 1997. Within this context, poverty may be defined as a state of deprivation. The concept of deprivation indicates the process by which people become poor. Conceptualizing poverty from a multi-dimensional perspectives emphasizes on integration on the different concerns and needs originating from different dimensions of poverty. Among different dimensions, gender is an important concept for the analysis and eradication of poverty. Although poverty affects both men and women, it has a gender dimension. Gender dimension of poverty indicates how men and women experience poverty in different ways, and almost in all circumstances, women suffer from men more acutely than men from poverty. The experience of poverty is both shared and distributed within families. All suffer, but women suffer more than men. Poverty is sometimes equated with certain conditions of material scarcity manifested in the high proportion of landless and poor households exposed to unemployment, low calorie intake, high incidence of child labor, high levels of child mortality, and low life expectancy. Poverty is also powerlessness that reduces people's capacity to earn sustainable livelihoods. Poverty is also linked to unequal access to and distribution of resources and lack of control in productive resources and limited participation in political and economic institutions. Women's access to the needed required resources and services is much less than men, and this contributes immensely to make women the poorest of the poor. And conceptual framework to understand women's poverty and the underlying reasons include three aspects. These are unemployment problems, support systems, and social attitudes. Now, 52. Women's poverty, a conceptual framework. Background aspects of women's poverty, individual and household behavior regarding community level conditions, individual and household characteristics, support systems, social attitudes, employment problems, women's standard of living, which leads to consumption, nutrition, migration, adoption of innovation, desired family size, contraceptive use, healthcare, especially of children, children's education, children's age, use of children, child labor, group and community participation by women. Now, source. Eva Moeller, Measuring Women's Poverty in Developing Countries in Myra Buvinic, etc., Women in Poverty in the Third World, Baltimore and London, Johns Hopkins University Press. The framework explains the relationship among these three aspects of women's poverty and their organs and effects. Employment problems and support systems affects women's standards of living, which in turn affects individual and household decisions and behaviors dictated by the social attitudes. Aspect of women's poverty. 1. Unemployment problems. A person may be viewed as poor when he or she does not have adequate access to the necessities of life. Reorganizing that necessities are defined differently at successive stages of economic development and in different cultures. People gain access by means of work paid either in cash or in kind. The productivity of work depends on the capital, land, tools, equipment, and technology that a worker has at his or her disposal. It also depends on the worker's human capital assets such as health and education. The inadequacy of these capitals and technological inputs in as much as cause of women's poverty as are in the insufficient number of jobs available to women and the social restrictions on women's labor force participation. 2. Support systems. It is often found that people gain access to the necessities of life by means of support systems. Support systems may be private, economic assistance from kinship groups, friends, or other mutual help networks. Public support systems include social security, welfare, free medical care. Now, support systems may also take the form of transfers of money, goods, labor, that is, help in the fields, for example, with childcare or other services. In the context of Bangladesh or other developing countries, usually these support systems may take various forms. For example, in many families, support systems are provided by helping relations who may be poor and they may be helped by giving money on a monthly or annual basis. Some may provide education belongings to kin groups, some may be helped at times of illness, many others offers help by providing regular support or to widowed or separated sister or daughter. Again, child provides support to aging parents. Nowadays, support systems are also provided by transfer of money regularly when immigrants labor remit money to their parents or family members in the rural areas. Support may also be given irregularly in the form of large or small, so during special occasions such as weddings, birthdays, gifts for newborn child, festivals, etc. However, due to their childbearing and rearing responsibilities and social restrictions on their labor force participation, women tend to be more dependent on support systems than men. Recently, one of the problems that women in developing countries are facing is the deterioration of the private support systems under the influence of rapid and ongoing economic and cultural changes. Those people who have been providing assistance in some form or another to the relations, kin, and friends are no longer in a situation that they can provide these services because they themselves are not in a position to provide their own survival needs in an appropriate and adequate manner. Consequently, those who are in the habit of receiving support services become poorer than before. Again, those migrant laborers sending remittances for their families back home are often sent back to their country due to false promises given by their employment agencies or sometimes without any prior notice, resulting in acute poverty and the brunt of poverty are faced by the women. Often the remittances do not reach the concerned families, and women staying back at home managing the family suffer the burden of poverty. In Bangladesh, there are no system of providing public support system, and so are those countries like Bangladesh, mostly in the developing world, in which familiar obligations are weakening, then have not yet reached a level of development at which they can afford and organize public support systems. Uncertainty regarding access to the basic necessities of life is likely to affect women's social attitudes. It is commonly held that insecurity, uncertainty may generate fear of deprivation, inability to take risks, willingness to subordinate oneself to others, desire to strengthen family ties and have large families. Although such attitudes can result in part from poverty, they can also contribute to poverty in preventing women from taking action to strengthen their economic position. For example, they may be prevented from 1. Obtaining more education, 2. Taking a more active role in decision making within the household, 3. Forming voluntary associations of women, being politically active, 5. Demanding access to vocational training, 6. Credit, child care facilities, 8. Taking more economic risks. Regarding poverty-related attitudes among women in developing countries, however, we find that on one hand, weakening of familiar support systems foster traditional attitudes, while on the other hand, it frees women from familiar constraints, including them to pursue employment opportunities more vigorously and to seek more equal roles in the family and the community. To conclude the discussion on this issue, an operational definition of the concept of women's poverty should include 3 measurable aspects that require study at the micro level. The figure depicts the relationship among these 3 aspects of women's poverty and their origins and effects. 1. Employment problems and support system affects women's standard of living, which is the result of women's earnings and or the income women receive from the other family members. 2. Women's standard of living and 3 aspects of women's poverty affect individual and household decisions and behaviors. Data on employment problems, support systems, and social attitudes should enable us to measure the incidence and extent of women's poverty level. Such data also establishes to analyze the causes and consequences of female poverty, which is a necessary first step towards making policy changes. Feminization of poverty. The term feminization of poverty was first coined by Deanne Pierce, 1978, to describe trends in the United States, where it was argued that 2/3 of the poor over the age of 16 were women. Today, it implies that women as a class is likely to be poorer than men under the present capitalistic economic system, especially in third world developing countries. According to Rochelle and Ann Witham, 1986, there is a built-in mechanism in many societies that perpetuates the feminization of poverty. Women have become steadily poorer in the context of an increasingly merciless struggle for scarce resources and a denser concentration of wealth at the top of a steep pyramid. It is a context of resource loss, dispossession, and impoverishment. Over the years, similar claims have been made for countries in the ASCAP region. ASCAP 2000, ADB, and UNDP have also described poverty as having a woman's face. Of the 1.3 billion people in the world living in poverty, 70% are women. UNDP 1997, two-thirds of the poor in Asia are women. ADP 1995, IFAD 1992 found that in addition to a gap between women and men caught in the cycle of poverty has continued to widen in the past 3 decades. Between the period 1965 to 70 and the mid-1990s, the number of rural women living in poverty increased by 48%, while the number of rural men living in poverty increased by 30% in the same period. At the same time, there has been a general perspective of an increasing incidence of female headship of households on a global scale. The alarming trend is referred to as feminization of poverty. Bolvinick and Gupta 1997, women living in poverty are denied access to critical resources such as credit, land, and inheritance. The labor is unrewarded and unrecognized. Their health care and nutritional needs are not given priority. They lack sufficient access to education and child support services, and their participation in decision making at home and in the community is minimal. UNDAW 2008. What causes the feminization of poverty? The growth of female-headed households. According to IFAD, female-headed households dominate the poverty statistics. Power 1993, according to noted Indian economist Jita Sen. Among individual households, based on any criteria, female-headed households tend to be poorest. Sen 1991. Female-headed households are typecast as the poorest of the poor on grounds of their allegedly greater likelihood of being poor and of experiencing more pronounced degrees of indigence than male-headed households units. Chan 2001. These notions confirmed the view that poverty was a major cause of female headship through forced labor migration, family breakdown due to financial crisis. Okay, page 55. Dowry-related stress, etc. Consequently, female-headed households are regarded as exacerbating poverty because women are time and resource constrained by their triple burdens of employment, household, and childcare, and also because they are discriminated against the labor market. Exacerbating. There has been an increase in the number of female-headed households in both developed and developing countries, for example, due to migration of male labor to Middle Eastern countries as well as to Malaysia and Singapore. There has been a tremendous rise in the female-headed households in rural Bangladesh. However, these women do not have access to remittances from their male earners and also remain poor. In addition, female-headed households are more vulnerable to increased unemployment and reduction in social services for the state. Intra-household inequalities. The unequal allocation of resources within households began to receive considerable attention in the late 1980s based on studies from South Asia. There has been a systematic deprivation of women vis-a-vis men in many societies. There is anti-female discrimination in health and nutrition originating within the household. There are other forms of intra-household unequal distribution which results in the perpetuation of female disadvantage and a vulnerability to destitution in extreme situations. For example, intra-household inequalities may take the form of gender-differentiated decisions on the part of parents regarding education and marriage of their children. The vast majority of rural women and women living in urban slums in Bangladesh suffer intra-household inequalities in the distribution of food and other resources. Moreover, Bangladesh is among those South Asian countries where the sex ratio is unbalanced and is 106 men to 100 women. The age of marriage for girls is low, 18, and the fertility rate is high. The majority of women remain illiterate. The paid labor is predominantly male, and women are economically dependent on men. World Bank. Women are circumscribed by cultural patterns and customs regarding marriage, divorce, inheritance, and mobility. The average woman is born into near slavery, tends a life of drudgery, and dies invariably in oblivion. The grim condition is the stark reality of half our population simply because they happen to be women. World Bank 2000. Apart from the small urban educated middle and new elite constituting only 5% of the total female population in the country, which has produced outspoken feminists and well-known scholars as well as prime ministers and leaders of opposition parties. The vast majority of Bangladeshi women, especially rural women and those living in the urban slums of big cities, suffer intra-household inequalities and discriminatory legal systems and extreme poverty. bias against women and girls. Bangladesh is a patriarchal son preferring society where there are existing biases towards women and girls. By keeping females locked into a patriarchal family situation, basic rights of women and girls are also denied. As a result, they are denied all opportunities in life, leaving them extremely vulnerable and poorer. Kagatrey, 1998, points out that feminization of poverty has been used to mean three distinct things. Women have higher incidence of poverty than men. Women's poverty is more severe than that of men. There is a trend to greater poverty among women, particularly associated with rising rates of female headship of household. Katagay, 1998. Current debates and challenges of feminization of poverty. There has been a remarkably persistent notion that poverty is intergenerationally perpetuated because female heads cannot properly support their families to ensure their well-being. Chant 2001-19. Although it is undeniable that women suffer disproportionately from social and economic inequalities, whether these disadvantages result in women-headed households is uncertain. An important issue to be considered here is that choices may be made between different material, psychological, and symbolic aspects of poverty. Empirical evidence from research studies in Bangladesh, India, and other South Asian countries suggests that women who have split up with their spouses may resist men's offers of child support because this may hinder their autonomy. To be explicit, it implies that some women prefer to cope with financial hardship rather than pay the price that maintenance can bring with it, such as having to be engaged in sexual relations. Similarly, women who choose to leave their husbands may have to make financial sacrifices. This not only means doing without male earnings, but forfeiting property and other assets. Although these actions may lead to an increase in poverty and the price of women's independence may be high, the resultant scenario is that rather than feminization of poverty that seems to be occurring is feminization of responsibilities and obligations. Chachachi, 2001-11. Examples from other third world countries assert that although female-headed households have lower income than other households, female-headed households are not under the same violent oppression and are not as powerless as women living with male partners. It has also been observed that female household heads often remark that they find it easier to plan their budgets and expenditures when there is no man around, even when their earnings are low. They also claim that they experience less stress and feel better able to cope with material hardships because their lives are free of emotional vulnerability, dependence, subjugation, and fear. Chant 2003-12. These findings confirm that poverty is constituted of more than income. It is conceived of as a package of assets and entitlements, within which the power to earn and manage expenditure, to mobilize labor, and to gain access to social and community support are vital elements to understanding the relation of women and poverty. Conclusion. The situation of women has deteriorated in many parts of the world, especially in developing countries where economic stagnation, rapid population growth, growing burden of debt, and reduction of public expenditures in social services have constrained the opportunities for enhancing women's situation in the sphere of education, health, and employment, which are the three indicators of development on the basis of a study based on 7 single mothers in 7 countries: Australia, Brazil, China, Egypt, India, Scotland, and Uganda. It has been concluded that women are pitted against 2 enemies. First is poverty, which tugs them down on the lowest rungs in their societies. Second is patriarchy, which sabotages their attempts to climb higher. Due to this, the consequences are that women are at a receiving end of the poverty trap. Women continue to face high levels of maternal mortality. Women suffer from nutritional deficiencies, have less access to health care. Few girls attend school. Few girls complete school, start work at an early age, work for less, work for nothing. Women face the double shift of reproductive and productive responsibilities. Women encounter increasing responsibilities and demands without the commensurate equal resources and benefits. Throughout their lives, women suffer restrictions in their life choices. They are exposed to discriminatory attitudes and unjust social and economic pressures and inadequate resources. Inequality in all its aspects derives from cultural patterns that perpetuate the lower status accorded to women in the family, the workplace, the society, and the state. It derives women of the opportunity of full and equal participation as citizens within their own societies and within international society. Chinkin, 1999. While the gender gap is closing in Bangladesh for most social indicators, the overall level of equality measured in terms of literacy, workforce participation, property rights, health and care facilities leaves much to be desired. However, several areas of critical importance need to be emphasized for improving the situation of women and enhancing their advancements. These include policies and institutional actions to combat continuing negative self ratios, violence against women, high maternal mortality, restrictions on women's employment and economic opportunities, policies to ensure formal equality, supporting affirmative action at all levels and in all spheres, creating women-friendly institutional environment, generating gender disaggregated statistics, and increasing the political voice of women. Mahtab 2007. End of chapter 3.